GCSE. This is Macbeth Lesson 3. So, if you haven't seen the first two, go back and have a look at those because this will link in with those. But if you have seen the first two, then this is where we start looking at Macbeth himself. Now, Macbeth is incredibly important in the play, obviously, because it's called Macbeth. So we need to know a lot about Macbeth for our essays, and this is where we start. This is where we first meet him. So he first appears in Act 1, Scene 2, after the witches scene that starts us off, the very short scene that starts the very start of the play off. So we're here with Act 1, Scene 2, and Macbeth's character. Now, Macbeth starts to fall from grace very quickly, and we'll start to look at that in this video. But to start with, we need to think about how he's established as a hero. So we don't actually meet Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 2, but we do get to hear about him. So the thing that happens is we get to see Macbeth through the eyes of the captain, who relays what's happened on the battlefield to King Duncan. So Duncan speaks to this captain who's been injured, and the captain gives Duncan information about what's happened in the battle, and specifically about Banquo and Macbeth, especially Macbeth. Okay, so Shakespeare's time, there's no way that they'd have space or the cast to recreate a huge battle like you might see in a film nowadays. So there's no point in them trying to show you how good Macbeth is in battle, because it had just seemed like a few guys on stage and not this huge battle for Scotland, which was actually going on. So what they do instead, very cleverly, is they bring Duncan in and Malcolm and a few of the other thanes as they come in and out in Act 1, Scene 2. And we have this captain telling the audience and Duncan exactly what's happened in the battle, so we get a real idea about how massive on scale this battle is and what Macbeth and Banquo's contribution has been to this battle. So that's kind of what Act 1, Scene 2 is all about. So as always, look, if you've got your book lying around, your copy of Macbeth, make sure you open it now. Let's have a look at Act 1, Scene 2, so you've got a feel for what's going on in this scene. If you haven't got that, pause the video and go and get your copy of Macbeth and bring it back, and then you can start annotating and going through it so we can talk about it. So one of the most important things that we find out in this scene is how significant Macbeth has been to the victory of Scotland in this battle. That's one of the most important things to Duncan, because he's the King of Scotland, but also to us as an audience, because we need to know what sort of a character Macbeth is. So we get a feel from that. And here, look, we've got a few of the key quotes that illustrate what sort of a guy Macbeth is when it comes to battle. All right, and what I've done here, look, you can just see next to each of the quotes is the line number that it's from. So what I'd recommend you have a go at doing is finding your copy of Macbeth and going through it, have a look for these quotes, maybe highlight them and then annotate them. So write a little bit of something about them on your copy of Macbeth, so you've got some notes that you can flick through and see. So when the captain refers to Macbeth as Brave Macbeth, and then in brackets it says, well, he deserves that name, that's on line 16, you can see that Macbeth's been established as being a significant character in the battle that's taken place. Now, he's already an important character, Macbeth. He is a thane in this already. So he's the Thane of Glamis when he starts the play, and that's quite an important title. So it's not like he's nobody and it's a surprise, but Macbeth's ability to fight is one of the things that wins them the battle, and that's kind of illustrated as well when the captain says that he unseamed him from the nave to the chops. Now that essentially means, in terms of what Macbeth's done in battle, is that he's cut someone in half, but long ways, if you can imagine how that looks. So if you can imagine somebody sort of being sort of unseamed, which is quite a nice word, really. Well, it's not a nice word, it's a disgusting word, but it's quite a clever word to use. But it kind of makes it seem like he's brought this guy apart, but it's kind of referring to the fact that all the way up his body, he's been cut in half long ways. And that's quite significant in itself, because it does illustrate how powerful Macbeth is, and it would also instill fear in other people that this guy has kind of completely cut someone in half. So I want you to think not just about Macbeth as being brave and a good leader in that sense, because we don't really get a sense of him as a leader, but we get a sense of him as a really powerful soldier who is excellent in battle. So that's a really useful quote for that. Duncan refers to him as, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman," on line 24, as you can see there, and there's an exclamation mark at the end of that, and that shows just how much esteem Duncan bestows upon Macbeth. how he feels about Macbeth, and especially in this context because Macbeth has helped them almost single-handedly win this victory. All right, Ross, when he turns up, he references Macbeth and calls him Bellona's bridegroom. Now, Bellona is supposedly the goddess of war. So if you can imagine that we've kind of got an element of imagery here where Macbeth is almost like the groom, the husband of the goddess of war. That's how amazing he is. And that reference is what we call a cultural allusion, and that is something that happens quite a bit in Macbeth and in Shakespearean plays. So him referencing other belief systems and mythology, that's quite a popular thing. And we'll look at that as we go through. But in this particular case, calling him Bellona's bridegroom is huge, because what it does is it turns around and it says, look, Macbeth is almost like the husband of the goddess of war. And that shows exactly how they feel. Okay, so that's there because we need to understand that in this scene, the first time we hear Macbeth mentioned in any sort of sense, what we end up with is this idea of Macbeth as being this brave and loyal warrior and an excellent soldier who can almost turn a battle single-handedly. And that is very important because we need to establish Macbeth as this hero. Why does Macbeth need to be portrayed as a hero at the very beginning of the play? Well, have a think about that for a second. Why do you think that Shakespeare is going to try and make Macbeth seem like a really significant hero at the beginning of this play? Brave, loyal, excellent soldier. Why are those qualities important when we look at this character at the very beginning? Have a little think about that for a second. What is Shakespeare trying to achieve by making him seem so significant in these areas? Well, realistically, you need to think that if Macbeth is this sort of character and later on in the play he starts to fall from grace and he becomes a traitor and he becomes a terrible king, it kind of is there to show the transition between a hero and a villain. And he needs to be set up as a really significant hero to then turn into a really horrendous villain. And that transition is much more impressive if we show that on stage rather than showing somebody he's kind of all right, but he's not great and he's a bit evil and now he's gone a bit more evil. Well, that's not really that exciting for an audience to see. They want to see somebody who starts the play as being the ultimate hero and ends the play as being the ultimate villain. That movement through is very important. And it's also very important for your essays. So from that point of view, these quotes at the beginning, they establish Macbeth as a hero, and that helps you show how Macbeth turns into a villain later on. So that's why they're important. And you can put some of those notes on your annotation when you go through your copy of Macbeth, and they'll be useful at the end of this video because some of the questions I'm going to ask you, they will reference those ideas. So then we move on to Act 1, Scene 3. And this is where Macbeth does appear, and we see him for the first time, and he's with Banquo, and he meets the witches. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on the actual witches at this stage. We'll go back to the witches in a few videos' time. But what I want to do here is just think about the way that Macbeth reacts to the prophecy of becoming king. So the pair of them, Banquo and Macbeth, meet the witches, and they have the prophecies given to them, which you should already know if you've read the play, and that is that Macbeth will become the Thane of Cawdor, and then he'll become king, and that Banquo won't be king, but that he will be heir to a line of kings. So those things are significant in themselves, but we want to examine here how Macbeth starts to decline in terms of his loyalty to our king, King Duncan, at the moment in time. So a couple of quotes here, and again, we've got the line numbers next to them, look. What we want to look at here is Banquo saying, "Why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" And that is really significant because it shows how Macbeth reacts to the idea and the prospect of becoming king. And when Banquo says, "Why do you start?" that shows that Macbeth is physically affected and shocked by the prophecy that the witches make. Banquo doesn't necessarily take it too seriously, but Macbeth seems to do so. And then Banquo says, and seem to fear things that do sound so fair. And we've got a little bit of juxtaposition in there again. Look, fear things that sound so fair. We've got that idea of why would you be scared of something that sounds really good? And those opposites starting to creep in. But Banquo doesn't understand why he would fear that. Now, we never get told why Macbeth reacts in this way. There are a few reasons why he might. Maybe because he's never considered becoming king before. Maybe for him to become king, it implies that Duncan would have to die. So all those things may be very shocking to him. Also, he may not want to be king. He may not want that responsibility, being as he's not considered it previously. So that's quite important. So we think about the way that he reacts in quite a fearful way. And we already know that Macbeth's not really scared of much. So this fear starts here. That's the beginning of the fear. Banquo also goes on later to suggest that he's kind of got the measure of the witches a little bit already. When he says, to win us to harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. Now, that quote does go on a little further, and there are a few other words you could pick out of it. But that's the crux of it, this idea that to win us to harm, to sort of harm us, instruments of darkness, so anything outside the great chain of being, anything that evil, can tell you truths that then start to drive you towards things that are a little bit darker and a little bit more corrupt and lead you down a path. Banquo understands this at the very beginning, that maybe these are not good points. But that's an illustration of how good a character Banquo is. Whereas Macbeth says this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. He kind of makes it seem like it can't be a bad thing and it can't be a good thing. And he goes on to explain why he thinks that, but at the same time, he doesn't have the same insight that Banquo seems to have. And he seems to be very much on the fence about, well, you know, these people have told me this stuff and it looks like it might come true because they told me I'd be Thane of Cawdor and now I am Thane of Cawdor. So realistically, I may end up becoming king, and that can't be a bad thing or a good thing. And I'll just leave it at that. So he doesn't seem to get the fact that maybe the witches are trying to manipulate him in some way, whereas Banquo is already incredibly wary of that situation. Now, Macbeth goes on at the end of this to say, if chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. And what that means is, he's saying, well, if I will end up being king, I will do it without having to do anything, because I've already become Thane of Cawdor without having to act at stepping forward myself and trying to make myself Thane of Cawdor. So if I am to become king, I don't have to step forward and make myself king. So he kind of makes a decision that he's not going to try to become king. He's not going to do anything specific to make himself king. It will just leave it to chance, and eventually it will happen. So that's significant because already in this one scene, Macbeth goes from almost being scared of the prospect of becoming king to deciding, well, if I am to be king, I'll just leave it to chance and we'll wait for fate to decide and crown me. And we have got a slight change in attitude already in this scene about how he feels about becoming king. But we've also got, for the first time, this division between Banquo and Macbeth. And that's important in itself, because Banquo and Macbeth are almost interchangeable at the beginning of the play before we meet them in battle. But even starting here, they start on two distinctly different paths as soon as the witches make their prophecies. And this is the first real insight we have into the fact that Banquo is wary and Macbeth is more open to the ideas of the prophecies. So that's worth looking at as well for so many different reasons. It links to all these different things about Macbeth and his transition and his downfall. It links to the idea of Banquo and him setting himself up as a good and loyal character who's very different to Macbeth towards the end, and their changing relationship and their changing character as we go through. So all those different things link to these quotes that are on screen now. So make sure that you annotate some of those, because they'll be really useful to you. Even if you're picking out a few key words from them to illustrate these ideas, as long as you understand those points that we've got, you can use them in your essays. So where do we go from here? Well, we go to Act 1, Scene 4. Now, this is sort of the end of the last scene we're going to look at today, but it does show the difference and the change in mood of Macbeth in terms of his feelings about becoming king. So in this scene, it's really important that we understand contextually that the time in which Macbeth is set, which remember is not the same time as Shakespeare was writing. Yeah, the events of Macbeth are set about 600 years before Shakespeare even wrote Macbeth. So we're going back, say, 1,000 years towards when Macbeth was actually King of Scotland. So we're going back a long time. And during that time, the king or queen choose their own successor. They don't automatically pass the crown down to the next, their oldest son, for example. So King Duncan has an opportunity to choose the next king, even though he has two sons that are waiting to become king. He could choose somebody else if he wanted to. Macbeth's just been made the Thane of Cawdor, which is a step closer to becoming king because it's a promotion for him. So he feels like, oh, I have moved closer to becoming king. It's more likely to happen. But in this scene, Duncan also promotes his eldest son, Malcolm, to the Prince of Cumberland. And by doing that, it's a clear indication that Malcolm will become the next king, if nothing else happens. And as soon as that occurs, Macbeth understands that he is not going to become king if he doesn't do something about it himself. And the clearest link to that understanding is when Macbeth says at the end of this scene, "Stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." Now, very often when Shakespeare rhymes lines, he does insinuate that there's a heavy emotion attached to that particular thought. And obviously we've got the rhyme here of fires and desires, and that link is definitely there with a very strong emotion. And this is the first time that we see a dark side to Macbeth. We know that he's thinking about becoming king and he's thought about it. He's gone from being scared to considering it but not intending to do something. But as soon as Duncan puts an obstacle in his way, when he makes Malcolm Prince of Cumberland, all of a sudden he starts understanding that he has to do something to become king. Now, stars hide your fires is very important. When we go back to the Great Chain of Being and the belief system, the idea that the stars would illuminate Macbeth and show people his black and deep desires is important, because we already know that Macbeth would fear not only the people that are around him and may end up exposing his treachery, but also things further up the Great Chain of Being, such as God and the stars and the planets and those sorts of ideas. They may be able to see into this world and see his crimes and carry it on into the next. So he's worried about that, and he does ask for this invisibility almost, so that they don't understand his black and deep desires. And it also shows that he understands what he's thinking about doing is incredibly wrong. So this is designed to show you that in a very short space of time, from not even meeting Macbeth, he's established as a hero, then already his head is being turned by the witches and the prospect of becoming king. Now, that's really important that we see that transition start very early in the play. And remember, we talked about this before, we don't always think about structure, but structurally here, this is a very quick process where Macbeth starts to deteriorate in terms of his loyalty to Duncan very, very quickly, as soon as the witches suggest that he may be able to become king. So, let's have a look at what we found today. Remember, if you haven't done so already, go back and have a look at these quotes and annotate them in your copy. All right, in your copy of Macbeth, make sure you've annotated the key quotes so that you've got that as a useful resource for revision and understanding. And you can use those annotations now when we look at this. So the summary today, we need to look at the summary. And what you need to be able to do is understand how Macbeth's portrayed in Act 1, Scene 2. We know he doesn't appear in it, and it's a captain that's relaying the information. But how is he portrayed by Shakespeare at the very beginning before we meet him? So look at your annotations. I want 3 adjectives to describe Macbeth that you can use those key quotes that we've looked through to prove. So think about 3 words we could use to describe Macbeth and how those key quotes are going to work. The next bit is, how does Macbeth's attitude to the idea of becoming king change through Scene 3 and Scene 4? So Act 1, Scene 3, Act 1, Scene 4, how does Macbeth's attitude towards becoming king change in those different scenes? Try and summarise his feelings and intentions. And again, use those key quotes because they're really useful in showing how he feels and what he's thinking. So that's your summary. That's the knowledge. That's the stuff you need to know and how you use the quotes. We need to be able to know that and then use it to answer some questions. So our big questions for today are, why is it important that Macbeth is shown as being a hero at the very beginning of the play? So I want you to have a go at answering that. Why is it important that Macbeth is shown as being a hero at the very beginning of the play? So show me how he's established as a hero, but then say, why is that significant? What effect does it have on an audience? Yeah. And when as we go through the story and he starts to become a villain, why is him being a hero at the beginning really important? So you could talk about structure, and that's effective and a good thing to talk about. And then don't forget to talk about context as well. All right, so anything you can bring in contextually, make sure that you can think about that. Then your second question, big question, is how will an audience react to Macbeth's changing attitude to becoming king? So how does an audience react when Macbeth starts to turn into something a little bit darker, when he starts to think about doing bad things and taking matters into his own hands to become king? So again, structure, think about how quickly his attitude changes. We just discussed that. Look at the Great Chain of Being from the first video, and look at the final key quote from Act 1, Scene 4, and link it to that. And then also think about, what is it that's making Macbeth's attitude change? And what are the factors that contribute to that change? What occurs? How does that link to him deciding to go from not even considering being king to all of a sudden working out how he can take matters into his own hands to ensure he's the next king? Those are two really big questions at the very early stages of this play. So if you can have a go at answering those and you can come up with some decent quotes, you can talk about structure, you can talk about context, you're doing a really good job. So make an effort with that. See if you can manage to get some of those things written down, and make sure you've got your annotations in place. Next time we're going to look at Duncan as a character. So the next video, lesson 4, will be all about Duncan. And I'll see you then.